Hello, I'm Kelly, and I'm here to talk about one of my favorite sources to learn about the English women of early Virginia. The first two English women arrived in 1608, and more continued coming from that point forward. So why don't we hear more about them? For one simple answer: they weren't English men. The women weren't keeping journals to speak of, few letters can be traced back to them, and they certainly weren't running the colony. So where do we go to learn about them? There's the archaeology, of course. Evidence of English women around Jamestown includes drop spindle whorls, bodkins, rings, and even a cupboard. But who were these women? One of my favorite sources to learn about them is the minutes of the Council and General Court of Colonial Virginia. Now, two things to keep in mind. What's left of this record only covers 1622 to 1632 and 1670 to 1676. Second, if you're in the court records, it's likely for something out of the ordinary. But that's okay. One woman who shows up a number of times in these records is Isabel Perry, though she's normally referred to simply as Mrs. Perry. And if you want to get really technical, her complete name would eventually become Isabel Smith Pace Perry Menifee, as she accomplished something a number of other Jamestown women accomplished. That would not have happened back in England. She rose up the social ladder each time she remarried. Isabel came to Jamestown the wife of a carpenter, but by the end of her life, she had married a highly respected member of the Council of State who controlled hundreds of acres of land and held great political power. But back to the story. Isabel never appears in the court records being accused of anything unjust. Rather, most of the entries involve her testifying as a witness in the cases of other women. Let's look at a few of these stories. First, we have Mrs. Blaney, also known as Margaret. As the story goes, Margaret miscarried a child and accused Dr. Pott of being responsible for the miscarriage, because after he killed a hog of hers without permission, he then denied her a piece of the hog's flesh, which may have prevented her from losing the baby. After Mrs. Isabel Perry was sworn in, she stated that she, being in Mrs. Blaney's house, Dr. Pott came into the house, and Mrs. Blaney said unto him, "Mr. Dr. Pott, you have killed a hog of mine. I would you would let me have a part with you." To which Dr. Pott replied, "It is true there is a hog killed, but whether it be yours I know not." Mrs. Blaney replied, "It is apparent enough it is mine." The doctor said, "As I take it, my wife hath given it amongst her people." Mrs. Perry further saith, "She knoweth Mrs. Blaney miscarried, but whether it were before or after she doth not know. Neither could she perceive any alteration in Mrs. Blaney upon those speeches between them." After several other witnesses, the court concluded that it is no slander that Mrs. Blaney chargeth Dr. Pott with denying her a piece of flesh, whereupon she miscarried, because she hath taken her oath that she thinketh in her conscience that it was the occasion of her miscarrying. But it no way appeareth, and it is barbarous to imagine, that he had any conceit. She had a longing to it, but thought it was spent by his wife. Was Isabel satisfied with this verdict? We have no way of knowing. But what is interesting is that the very next time the court convened, Isabel was back, this time relating what seems to be a rather random tale from up to 14 years earlier. Anne Layden was one of the first two women who arrived in 1608, but it's what happened several years later that made it into the court records. As Isabel recalled, that in the time of Sir Thomas Dale's government, Anne Layden and Jane Wright and other women were appointed to make shirts for the colony servants, and had 6 needles full of thread allowed for making of a shirt, which if they did not form, they had no allowance of diet. And because their thread was not and would not serve, they took out a ravel of the lower part of a shirt to make an end of the work, and others yet had thread of their own made up with that. So the shirts of those which had ravelled out part plied shorter than the rest, for which fact the said Anne Leyden and Jane Wright were whipped, and Anne Leyden, being then with child, the same night thereof, miscarried. Why did Isabel share this story? Is it just a coincidence that the women in both stories suffered miscarriages, and that both miscarriages could be blamed on men? We will never know. Now, in Anne's story, another woman, Jane Wright, was also punished over the shortened shirts. But that was only part of her troubles. 9 people had testified in court that Jane Wright was a witch. As part of Isabel's testimony, she said that upon the losing of a log of lightwood out of the fort, Goodwife Wright railed upon a girl of Goodwife Gates for stealing of the same, whereupon Goodwife Gates charged the said Goodwife Wright with witchcraft, and said that she had done many bad things at Kecoughtan, whereupon this examination chided the said Goodwife Wright, and said unto her, If thou knowest thyself clear of what she charged thee, why doest thou not complain, and clear thyself of the same? To whom Goodwife Wright replied, God forgive them, and so made light of it. And the said Goodwife Wright threatened Gates' girl and told her that if she did not bring the lightwood again, she would make her dance stark naked. And the next morning, the lightwood was found in the fort. Isabel was the only witness who did not directly accuse Jane Wright of witchcraft. She simply bore testimony of what she had heard from Jane and those who were accusing her. And it is interesting to note that Jane did make light of the accusations and even used them to her advantage to get the missing wood back. And by the way, there are no entries in the court records to indicate Jane was ever found guilty of witchcraft. So what do we think of Isabel? There are those who consider her a gossip for showing up in the court records so often. I see a woman who wasn't tearing other women down, but was pointing out injustices toward them. And it may not have resulted in anything other than letting us see a 17th century English woman who was not afraid to stand up in the courts and leave us with these unique snippets of women's lives in Jamestown. But that's just my opinion. If you'd like to read more of Isabel's testimony and dive deeper into the court records, you can look up the minutes of the Council and General Court of Colonial Virginia online at archive.org. Thank you for joining me today. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more videos about Jamestown Settlement and the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown.